Hello and welcome back. Now that we have a bucket created and an object uploaded to that bucket, it's time to talk about S3 permissions. So over here on the Orion papers, let's click on S3 permissions and talk a little bit about how these work. So first, it's important to understand that all buckets and objects are private by default. Only the resource owner has access. So who is the resource owner? Well, that is whoever created the bucket. So if I click on the Orion papers here, that's my bucket, and then onto permissions, I see here under users, Thomas has read and write for object access and read and write for permissions access. Well, I'm the owner, so by default, I have these accesses turned on or enabled by default. So how about for everyone else? Well, the resource owner can grant access to the resource, meaning the bucket or objects, through either what are called S3 resource-based policies, or access can be granted through a traditional IAM user policy. So what does that mean before we drop down and talk here about bucket policies and S3 access control lists? Well, if we go over to IAM, if you remember earlier on in this course, we set up a bunch of users and we gave them full access to S3. So if I click on Donna here, Donna has Amazon S3 full access. Well, this was a way of permissions being granted to Donna to be able to access all buckets and all objects in S3. So if I were to log in as Donna right now, even though she's not the owner, she would have access to be able to view this bucket and view these objects and or upload new objects and delete objects. Again, she has full access based upon the IAM user policy that has been granted to her. Now, besides an IAM user policy, you can also grant access to S3 resources through either bucket policies or S3 access control lists. So let's talk first about bucket policies. If we click again on permissions, we can see here that there are bucket policies. Now, bucket policies are policies that are only attached to an S3 bucket. They're not attached to an IAM user. So just to make that very clear, here we have an IAM policy that is attached specifically to Donna, granting Donna access to S3. And it's actually not directly attached, it's attached through a group, but for the argument's sake, this policy is attached directly to Donna, again, giving her access to S3. However, a bucket policy is attached to the bucket, and the bucket policy can say Donna has access. So Donna can have no access to S3 granted directly to her, but through an actual bucket policy, we can grant access to Donna. And Donna in this case would be known as a principal, but we'll get to that in a second. Next, the permissions in the bucket policy, so anything that we were to write here would be applied to all of the objects within the bucket. So if I write a bucket policy granting certain types of access, it would provide access to all of the objects within the particular bucket. So we're setting the permissions on the bucket level. So also with bucket policies, the policy specifies what actions are allowed or denied for a particular user of that bucket, such as granting access to an anonymous user, or who, meaning a principal, can execute certain actions like put or delete. So we can specify for the user Donna, can she put, can she delete? We can set up things like requiring multi-factor authentication for Donna to actually delete a bucket or an object in S3. We can also restrict access based off IP address, and this is actually generally used for CDN management. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to our CloudFront distribution section of this course. S3 bucket policies are also written in JSON format and are very similar in their look and feel to IAM policies. So we can click on documentation here, and we can actually take a look at some bucket policy examples. And so if you see here, here's a policy to grant read-only permission to an anonymous user. So we can copy and paste this in, and if you remember, this looks almost identical to an IAM access policy. So both S3 IAM user policies and S3 bucket policies are very similar but different ways of controlling who has access and what type of access they have for S3 buckets. Next, there are access control lists for S3. Now, this should not be confused with our network access control lists, which we spent a lot of time talking about during the VPC networking section of this course. These are completely different access control lists. I'll repeat that one more time. These are completely different and separate access control lists from the ones we worked with during our VPC networking section known as network access control lists. These are S3 access control lists. And basically what these do is these grant access to users in other accounts or to the public. So we see here we can grant object access to any authenticated users, so a user coming from another account, or also to everybody, meaning to everybody over the internet, not necessarily just somebody that's an IAM user, but literally anybody can have access to this particular bucket to view and list its contents. Also, both buckets and objects have access control lists. Object access control lists allow us to share an S3 object with the public via a URL link. So let's take a look at that. If we go back to objects here, click on an object, we see down here that there is a link here. Now, if I click on this link right now, I'm going to get an error. It's going to say access denied. Now, you may be saying to yourself, well, wait a second, you are the resource owner. Shouldn't you have this access? Well, no, because if I look over here under permissions, for managing public permissions, there is no access granted at all for public. I only have internal access right now. So if I were to actually go back to overview and click download, I can download from the S3 console because I have that type of access, but I can't access the public URL for this particular object. However, if I click here, make public, and then I switch back to permissions, we now see here that under everybody, object access is read. So that has now been granted. So read access has been granted on this particular object through the access control list for this object. So now if I go back to this link and I click on it, it just downloaded to my desktop. Now you may not have seen it here in this video, but it did just download to my desktop. So I can now take this link here and I can give it to friends, families, coworkers, a client, anybody that would need access to this particular file. I can provide them with this link and they can go ahead and access it. Now, if I didn't want this link to be fully accessible to everybody, I can always go back to permissions and I can set up access just for authenticated users as opposed to everybody. So there's a lot of granularity that you can do here to make objects and your links more secure. Now, if you ever want to restrict access, or meaning take this away, all you would need to do is click on this, and here under object access, you can select to either read or write, or then also for permission access to read or write, but you can just uncheck that there, click save, and we now see that read access for everyone is no longer here, and if I go back to overview and click on the link, it now gives me that error again. So now I've just taken access away for anybody over the open internet to access this object through this URL. So just to recap, I'm actually going to close out of here for a second. Back here on this diagram, I do have IAM here and S3 policies, but remember that in order to access an S3 bucket, or for an IAM user to access a bucket or an object within an S3 bucket, you don't have to have specific S3 permissions set up, meaning in the bucket like this. You can have an AIM full access policy or some type of an IAM access policy granting permission for a user to S3 or to a specific bucket, or you can set up specific permissions, meaning either an S3 bucket permission or access through an S3 access control list. So you have a lot of different options when trying to decide for your own account which method of access will work best for you. And with that, we will conclude this lesson. Thank you for watching. You may now move on.